your book really focuses on how there's this trust in technology, almost a blind trust. I think part of it is people don't understand it, and it also is this great white capitalist hope, right? Where all of our problems can be solved by this ethereal, difficult to understand, but ever solving technology, and that it's going to be the thing that saves us. And your book is very much not under that illusion. What do you make of that blind trust, and why did you feel that it was necessary to combat it, particularly in the context of transportation in your book?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think that those ideas really go back a really long time, right? We often have this association between technology and progress, right? Just because this new technology is invented, the idea is that, this is naturally the way that society should work, and we should adopt this, and this is what the future should be, right? And the book is certainly trying to say, like, let's hold on for a second there. Let's make sure that these technologies are actually in service of us as people, not just in service of these corporations that are putting them out into the world. And so the reason that I chose transportation to focus on it, beyond the fact that it's just something that I've been writing about for years and am very interested in, is that I think it does provide a good kind of illustration of these impacts of these dynamics, right? When we look at what Silicon Valley companies have been proposing for transportation over the past 10 years or so, whether it's Uber and the ride hailing services or autonomous vehicles or these other proposals that they have, and then looking at the history of these ideas, looking at the history of automobility more broadly, which we can certainly see as a disruption, quote unquote, of the transportation system. If we're thinking about what Silicon Valley likes to say about, what they do and their effect on society. And so I think it really kind of illustrates to us that we should definitely be more critical of what Silicon Valley is telling us their impact on the world is, and to ensure that these technologies, if we're going to adopt them, are actually going to help us and benefit us rather than just, kind of laying down and accepting whatever Silicon Valley wants us to accept.
Yeah, they also just, it is their thing to overpromise and underdeliver. I mean, that we see that across sectors, and I keep thinking back to, of course, the infamous Theranos example, right? But
Yeah.
I mean, it's instructive, it, largely about the way that Silicon Valley perceives itself, and when it comes to something like transportation, where people's lives are on the line, and it also has so much to do with how our country is structured, just in terms of infrastructure, that's a big thing to play around with.
Absolutely. The transportation system is so key, like, to people getting around, to people being able to access the services, get to their jobs, visit their friends, anything, right? You're dealing with the transportation system. And if we look at the transportation system that we have, you're in the US, I'm in Canada, North America, we're both very auto-dominated societies. It's been built up over time to make it so that most people need an automobile to get around, right? It's not even really a choice. You need to be reliant on this. And that has had a whole load of consequences. Just last year, the United States hit, a new record, as high as it's been since the 1990s of road deaths. For over 42,000 people were killed on American roads, and that has increased significantly in recent years. I think that is reason alone to be concerned about this. But then if we look at, the impact that it's had on our communities as we've built these really kind of sprawled out suburbs rather than, dense communities where we try to encourage some degree of, community life, I guess, that has really been lost. We look at the health effects of sitting in these cars for all this time, the environmental impacts, of course, of the local pollution, but also on climate change. There's so many reasons that we should want to look at this transportation system that we have and try to improve it. And certainly these tech companies, over the past decade or so have used that to promote themselves and to say, look, we had the solutions to all of your problems. But then if we look at what has actually come, we see that they haven't really solved much at all.
And the solution is one that centers around individual transportation, personalized transportation, which is obviously it undercuts the their glowing vision of themselves as environmental saviors, particularly Elon Musk. And I want to get into that in a bit. But the first chapter of your book really gets into the history of the car and how the U.S. became and North America more broadly, very fertile ground for this kind of techie, individualized transport time that we find ourselves in now. So let's go through that history a little bit. How did the automobile become completely necessary to exist in a great majority of places in our country and in North America broadly?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really kind of interesting to look back at it and to think like, Uber and Elon Musk and all these people have been telling us for the past decade or so that they're going to disrupt the transportation system, right? But really, we're all still dependent on cars. They haven't really changed a whole lot. But if we look back at, the turn of the century, the late 1800s, early 1900s, when the automobile is really emerging, that is really like a moment of proper disruption, right? This new technology is being invented, it's being put onto the road, but it's not the technology itself that really causes these changes. So if we look at the street in that moment, there are plenty of different ways to use it. There are plenty of different people using it. People are walking on the street, people are taking bikes, people are on the streetcar, are in horse-drawn carriages. There's little street vendors along the side of the street. On the side streets, children will be playing in the streets, right? So there are all these different uses, not just completely dominated by the car, but the car enters and it doesn't fit within those norms, right? Because it's going faster than everything else. It can move in ways that other forms of transportation can't. And you start to see more deaths on the road, particularly children and young women. And naturally, because these automobiles are not a mass product at the moment, they're very much a luxury product. Certain people are benefiting, but much of society is not, right? And are being put in greater danger by these vehicles that are increasingly on the roads and taking away their space as well. And so there are protests, right? There are opposition to this. People don't want the automobile to take over the streets in their cities. And at that time, people are really living in dense cities. There's not so much suburbs as we have today. And so what we see is that the industries, the kind of economic interests that are associated with the automobile start to work together, right? To not only change the way that people think about the street, but also to lobby the government in order to get them to change regulations, change policies, to subsidize the rollout of automobility. That's the auto companies, the suppliers to the auto companies, the oil companies, construction interests, because they'll be building the roads in the suburban communities to follow. And so there are plenty of reasons why these, companies will see a benefit to making this change. And so they get the government to kind of go along with that to ensure that it gets rolled out. And particularly in the post-war period, that's when we really see that expansion start to happen, when they're building out the interstate highway system. They're subsidizing mortgages so that people are moving out to suburbs. All of these things are happening in that moment to make people dependent on the automobile.
And that post World War kind of infrastructure build, it's really seen as, or written as in our history, as this positive development and this expansion of the country and this new frontier. But in terms of the city and what it did to the infrastructure of cities in our country, as you write, it was really cities and rural communities. But the suburbs come out of the advent and the proliferation of the automobile. What did it do to our cities, and what did it do in terms of creating this mid-tier between rural and urban life with the suburb?
Yeah, like if you think about the automobile, obviously it takes up quite a bit of space, right? And so if you want a lot of people to own cars, it just doesn't work for people to live in dense cities anymore, because you can't have people living in, apartment buildings or condos or what have you, and then also have their automobile. Like, where are you going to park it? And so that's when, the auto companies and certainly governments that are supporting this vision, recognize that there needs to be this suburban expansion, right? And so through the FHA, Federal Housing Association, I think it's called. They subsidize the build out of these suburban communities because they make it much more accessible for people to get mortgages, right? To move out to these communities. And certainly it's very specific people who they help to move out to those communities. Black people are largely excluded from that mobilization, from that movement out to the suburbs, because they are denied mortgages. And, there's redlining, there's a whole history around this. And then, that is really necessary for people to buy all these cars, for people to drive all these cars, for them to fit within the communities that, people are living in, essentially. And that has a lot of consequences, right? When you move all these people out to the suburbs, you expand the footprint of the city. You also kind of deconcentrate the city itself. So a lot of buildings are torn down or become derelict. A lot of room is made for parking spaces and parking lots within cities. And so there's a huge change there to, the city itself, the ability for the city to fund itself because it loses all this tax revenue, to the suburbs. Like there are a whole load of consequences that come of this, and it's certainly not positive for, I think the cities themselves. And we're only now starting to see more of a, I guess, resurgence or return to the city we've seen in the past number of years. But then there's also questions as to whether COVID is going to change that too.
Well, and as the city expands, though, public infrastructure or public transport, I should say, does not keep up with it, right?
Yeah.
So all of these cities now have kind of the outskirts where it's more difficult for people to get into the city, to move around, and it creates a new class of people, essentially, right? You could call it gentrification as well, in a way, where purchasing a car is not an option, and yet the city's so much more sprawled out that transportation is more difficult, and there is not the transportation investment that allows for mobility in those new communities and areas.
Absolutely. It's interesting when you go back to like the earlier proposals for the build out of streets and highways, and you see how they were multimodal, right? There was a recognition that there'd be space for cars, but there'd also be space for like a train or a streetcar or whatnot within these street designs. And then over time, you see that start to go away because the focus just becomes these are for cars, everything is for cars. We need to encourage people to be in cars. And certainly the automakers and the other interests around that are pushing that forward, are pushing that vision for the city and for the transportation system. And so you do get not only are public transit systems not expanded to those suburban expanses, so people living out there have to own a car to get around, but even within the city, the transit system degrades, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't cover the same degree of space as it used to. The streetcars are pulled up in many cities, so you lose that public transit, and when they're replaced by buses, it's much easier to kind of curtail bus routes and things like that. And even in New York, for example, the subway expansions of the subway, improvement of the subway really, doesn't get the same kind of energy and effort
Yes.
as it did before.
That's really what I mean. We're here in Brooklyn, and so that's what I was thinking of in terms of, like, the subway expansion in Manhattan. The subway is all over the place in those areas, but in Queens, in other parts of Brooklyn, it's much harder to get around, even still to this day. But so the the suburb comes around. The car industry is, pushing this onto people, and the government is following suit. How did the car contribute to the shrinking of public spaces during this time as well?
Absolutely. Like I was saying, there needed to be all this space for the car, right? To park your car, to drive your car. And that required pulling back these public spaces, turning them into parking lots. It was really like, a war on these public spaces in a sense. But also, you see the desire for capital to take over whatever public space constantly, right? That they can get their hands on effectively. But with the rollout of the car, you really do see the erosion of this. And I think you see it in particular, like you can see it when you look at the American city, but there are particular like examples when you look at European cities as well, because in the post-war period, they are also kind of undertaking this rollout of the car. And right now, cities like Amsterdam or Copenhagen are associated with cycling and being these kind of bicycle meccas. But when you go back to those moments, like in the 60s and in the 70s, when this transformation is really happening, when this attempt to entrench the car is really happening, you can see these public spaces turned into parking lots. You can see these buildings being torn down for streets, and this transformation is really happening. And over there, there's a successful effort to push back on that and to say, like, no, like this is not acceptable. We can't just have the car take everything over. Deaths are increasing, like we saw in the United States and Canada in the early days as the automobile was being rolled out. And so it really does eradicate like a lot of public spaces because the car takes precedence over all that.